Hello, I'm Tim Swanston filling in for Paul Barry this week, and welcome to Media Watch. Today on the show, the Nauru files. What was the response in the media, and can we put this issue to bed ethically, once and for all? First, what were the Nauru files? Well, Paul Farrell, a journalist with The Guardian Australia, got his hands on thousands of leaked incident reports from Australia's infamous detention camp for asylum seekers on the remote Pacific island of Nauru. The reports detail the assaults, sexual abuse, self-harm attempts, child abuse and living conditions endured by asylum seekers being held by the Australian government. The moral question here is, should The Guardian Australia have published the Nauru files? These documents are incident reports after all, which describe alleged incidents. The Australian's former weekend editor Nick Carter summed up his thoughts quite precisely on ABC's The Drum.
If a journalist had come to me with a USB stick and downloaded like this, I would have said, go away and finish the job. We don't know from this, Paul, with respect, we don't know how many of these cases have been reported before. We know some of them have. We don't know how many of the allegations have been proved. We don't know how many of them have gone to courts in Nauru, have been prosecuted by the Nauruan authorities who are the proper ones to do this.
However, journalists have been blocked in many instances from reporting on Nauru and other detention centres, and have been stilted by the government to be able to fact-check and corroborate these reports. So, given these restrictions, what is the journalist to do? Well, in support of publishing these files, weekly podcast show All About Ethics gave the deontological and consequentialist reasons why the Nauru files should have been published. In their first episode, the presenter, with a funnily similar voice to myself, argued that journalists should report all instances of abuse that they come across. In my view, according to universalisability, it would only make sense to have all journalists releasing accounts of abuse, rather than ignoring them. It's a journalist's duty to disclose all essential facts that come their way. Commenters were fired up at this idea.
Can we just imagine what would happen if, like you said, all journalists released accounts of abuse rather than ignoring them? This would not only rally violent sympathisers, it would polarise the Australian public, heightening discord and causing the destabilisation of our great nation. Don't we have a duty to our citizens first?
This analysis was very much based in Kant's categorical imperative, which, let's face it, is limited in its ability to provide nuance to discussion of what should and shouldn't be reported. But in any case, and with all due respect to the commenter on that piece, journalists do have a duty to their citizens, as the public has a right to know. A story that might upset one person could enrich the life of another. Even if the Australian public were to become outraged, this idea fits in with the fourth estate of journalism, to hold the government to account through the people power of its citizens. Joe Blogg saw the benefit in hearing the Nauru files story.
Well, my initial reaction and thought was, I guess, shock, horror, and heartache reading the reports and articles. But despite this, I still see the release of these files as a positive consequence. More than anything, it educated me on the situation. It made me feel this sense of empathy and an enlightened view on how refugees are processed and treated.
The commenters continued, arguing that a heavy media presence on Nauru would not be helpful.
If all journalists reported all of their findings from Nauru all the time, what would happen to other relevant and important news stories and those who consume them? I'm assuming they would simply get swept under the rug.
Now, this kind of thinking is truly unrealistic. Although these ethical thinkers have created these fantastical rules, when analysed, these seem impossible to follow when applied to real-life situations.
While I don't necessarily agree with the treatments of refugees in Nauru, I refuse to allow myself to be a target for the human interest stories, which are written with the only aim to create community stir and result in the purchasing of newspapers so that those who consider themselves well-informed can feed their own ego.
Now, while some people may feel this way, not wanting to be treated as a means to an end, the Nauru files aren't just another human interest story. They are of utmost importance to how the federal government runs offshore detention centres. Although some people may not like seeing these images,
I'm glad the media didn't report this, because as the average Australian, I don't want to hear all this sad news. I'd much rather my news was happy. Had I seen the media report this, I would not have bought that daily paper, as I imagine many others would have followed suit.
Journalists have a duty to disclose all facts that come their way, and it's the public's job to pick and choose what they find newsworthy If audiences are disturbed, they can turn away. The right to privacy was also discussed, which found commenters asking, do asylum seekers want a right to privacy? The podcast series argues that the publishing of the reports facilitates many forms of justice, a right that asylum seekers likely care much more about. Now, the internet also had a heated discussion of W.D. Ross's duties, something that I never thought that internet trolls would do. Sure, all of W.D. Ross's duties are based on relationships, and these duties could be construed in various ways. To us here in the office at Media Watch, we found the journalist's duty of fidelity to themselves and the code that they've entered into the most compelling duty. The release of the reports facilitates justice for asylum seekers, highlighting the humanitarian issue at hand. Ultimately, justice has proved to be the most important duty in this case. Looking at the consequentialist view, the podcast interviewed Joe Blogg, a member of the Australian public, a refugee, and a member of the Australian media, to assess if the report brought them benefits or harms, to give a utilitarian assessment of the impact of the story. Now, Joe Blogg highlighted how the release of these files personally educated him and broadened his opinions of the refugee situation. From this, Joe discussed how this sparked a movement of change and empowerment amongst the Australian public. Commenters had their say, arguing that the release would embarrass the government, leading to a complete subversion of authority. Refugee Cora Gatbonton discussed how the release of these files allowed a sense of hope for the refugees, and even the children in Nauru, and how this has brought upon this sense of unification and courage. In the long term, Cora hopes that these files could potentially lead to the shutdown of detention centres and enable a better quality of life that they strive for when they left their country. In my view, that's a great outcome for the asylum seekers, where they achieve a large benefit at little cost. Now, Mariko Prince, an expert in the Australian media, pinpointed that publishing the documents gained the trust, credibility, and helps break down this taboo surrounding the issue. Commenters raged that the abuse was only alleged, and that the public could read it entirely as fact.
Don't forget, the abuse is only alleged. I don't think the media should report anything alleged. The consequences of getting it wrong could be huge.
Media Watch thinks that the report is not misleading, as it does say that these are reports of alleged incidences, not facts. While not taking these reports as gospel truth is important, it builds on a larger picture of corroborated incidences of serious harm in refugee camps, which gives validity to these reports. But on this consequentialist view, who is the journalist to decide how much benefit this creates and for whom? How can a journalist objectively conduct a utilitarian analysis before they publish a story? We're all the victims of hindsight, after all. Now, we could also view this debate through the lens of virtue ethics. We could solve the question by asking, what kind of journalist do we want to be? The virtue ethics component was summed up well by a feature article written by Sophie Chin. She argues,
Pharrell's eudaimonistic attributes to support asylum seekers, raise awareness and encourage an Australian-wide conversation on the immense issue is an inspiration to us all.
Aristotle equated the question, what is eudaimonia, with the question, what are the best activities of which man is capable? What are the best activities that a journalist is capable of? I would argue Paul Pharrell and his long list of awards is a testament to the kind of journalist we should be. And if we strive to be like him, that is an ethical reason to be publishing. Journalists would be happy to prescribe to wanting to demonstrate these attributes that Paul Pharrell espouses. And in Aristotle's view, journalists should live well and achieve eudaimonia. In summary, this issue is extremely complicated, and it has been debated across the three key primary fields of ethics as taught in COMU3800. So, should The Guardian Australia have reported the Nauru files? Well, the moral challenges that exist for the journalist are that these are alleged accounts. They need to weigh up the public's right to know versus privacy of asylum seekers and the government. And assessing utility or the consequences of the report is a very ambiguous exercise. There's obviously no perfect model for deciding what is right and what is wrong, but these are the questions or challenges that a journalist needs to evaluate before they click the publish button.